You have just entered into a village which is nestled beside a dark forest. The villagers are terrified to enter the forest because they believe that it is the home of some terrible monster, which they call the Chort, or the demon. When inspecting the forest, you do find that there are tracks of some large creature with hooved feet, which walks around and inflicts claw marks upon the bark of the trees. There are animals that have been mutilated and feasted upon by this monster. There is one villager who has survived an encounter with the Chort, and you find them drinking away their trauma inside of the local tavern. There they tell you a story of a monster who stood at least 8 or 9 feet tall, crowned with great horns, and their hands massive claws with which they used to rip apart the compatriots of this particular witness. The individual also tells you that the Chort wore scraps of armour and clothing and had a sheath belted at their waist, but no weapon to speak of. This is puzzling. It is unlikely that a fey creature would wear such mortal accoutrement, and it is equally unlikely that a fiend would so easily misplace its weapon. Perhaps the Chort is not a monster at all, but an individual cursed to become a monster. There is a fortress nearby which you could use to gather clues, but can you make it there before the Chort catches up with you instead? Hello, my name is Ben Byrne and I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. In this video, I want to talk about how to represent monsters in a D&D campaign that is meant to have a dark fantasy atmosphere, and you should keep 5 main things in mind. Number 1, monsters need descriptions to make them feel real and frightening to your players. Number 2, monsters actually need to be dangerous. They need to pose a tangible threat to your players if they're going to intimidate them. Number 3, monsters are either intelligent or evolved in the way that they operate and fight or defend themselves. Number 4, monsters are thematic. They usually embody either a theme of dark fantasy or a human anxiety. And number 5, monsters need a narrative to make them feel immersed in the world and a natural part of it for your party to interact with. Let's dive in and talk about those 5 ideas so that you learn what you need to know about running dark fantasy D&D. And if you enjoy this video, make sure to give it a like to follow along, because I have so much more to share with you about how to run dark fantasy Dungeons and Dragons. Monsters are the centerpiece of many D&D campaigns, and if you want to feature them at the center of your dark fantasy campaign, they deserve lavish and detailed descriptions. And there's 4 reasons to take the time to describe your monsters properly in the context of a dark fantasy story. Number 1, it sets the atmosphere. There's a difference between saying a werewolf enters the chamber and saying the werewolf tiptoes its way as quietly as it can into the chamber, shreds of its own skin still hanging from its body from the horrific transformation it has just undergone. This can also create an emotional reaction with your players. They might feel particularly apprehensive once you describe a monster in a detailed way, more so than if you just kind of threw the name of the monster out there. And an apprehensive atmosphere when a monster arrives is what you want in a dark fantasy campaign. 3, not everybody knows what all monsters look like. There's the classic story of somebody saying, there's a gazebo in front of you, what do you do? And a player saying, I attack the gazebo, not understanding that a gazebo isn't a monster.
What are you doing?
Killing monsters.
Not everybody's going to know what a chimera looks like or what a manticore looks like. I very often get those 2 monsters specifically confused. And finally, describing your monsters more than just their physical appearance, their abilities, the way that they move, what they want in the way that they interact with the party. Are they instantly attacking, or are they trying to converse with the party and convince them of something? Describing the slow smile that comes to the Dryad's face as the party offer it something for the forest is going to give them clues about how this monster operates, and that can help them exploit in combat and in social encounters both the monster's weaknesses, but also avoid the monster's strengths. So how do you describe these monsters? Well, Try to use at least 2 to 3 of the senses when you're describing a monster for the first time to fully immerse your players into the encounter. So let's go back to their werewolf. They hear the slow, soft padding of the werewolf's feet as it tries to sneak into the room. Perhaps they just hear the click of its claws on the stone beneath it as it lifts its paw up off the ground. They can also hear its rasping breath, and they can smell the blood from its breath from its first victim that evening. They can see that it's got scraps of its own skin hanging off of itself, but they can feel how the fur is wet with blood and matted from the transformation. Feel free to write these descriptions down. You don't always have to go off the top of your head, and it's perfectly fine to sit and read the description out to your players in that moment where the monster is first being introduced. Try to get into the habit of doing this, because you do have players that you say a monster starts to creep into the room and they're like, fireball! They're already trying to do actions. Give the monster a little bit of time. Just tell your players, I'll take your actions in a second, but I just want you to know what this thing really looks like before you start interacting with it. And feel free to get a little bit gross with your descriptions or a little bit brutal with your descriptions, because that nestles back into the dark fantasy genre. For example, as this human slowly transforms into an aberrant horror, you can hear the cracking of bone and tearing of flesh inside of them as their chest opens up and the wet tentacles slither out from inside. You can hear a terrible, low moaning coming from the voice of the person, which definitely doesn't sound human, and you can see their insides are rotted and falling out as more of these aberrant appendages appear. Monsters are dangerous. Danger is a major theme of dark fantasy, and your player characters should be afraid that danger and death lurks around any corner, waiting to pounce upon them. But creating that atmosphere or that feeling of legitimate danger in 5e can be difficult, because the player characters are very powerful, especially once they start to get past even just level 6, 7, or 8. So you should rethink your encounters and rebalance them. Think about choosing monsters of a slightly higher challenge rating than you usually would. Creating an encounter for me is like creating stew without using measuring cups. Just getting the right amount of salt in there, the right amount of pepper until it just tastes mwah.
Hot and spicy meat. Yeah, boy.
Sprinkling in a few more monsters until the encounter becomes just dangerous enough that it's not a cakewalk for the party to slaughter their way through, but it's also not going to slaughter the party themselves. It's a challenging balance, but you get the feel for it the more encounters you build. And frankly, if you do build an encounter that the party just can't win, impossible situations are also a big theme of dark fantasy. Sometimes the threat is just too great, it cannot be overcome, and somebody is either going to die or the party are going to have to retreat, and that's okay. That's part of the dark fantasy genre. Alternatively, if you don't feel comfortable raising the difficulty of encounters because you're afraid you might accidentally kill everybody in the party, there are some alternative rules that you can use that also make encounters feel more difficult. For example, in the Grim Hollow campaign guide, there are alternative rules for rest mechanics, which mean that when the party sit down and they take 8 hours to go to sleep, they only get the benefits of a short rest. And if they want the benefits of a long rest, they need to take 2 to 3 days of downtime to get all their spell slots and all their party resources back. This means that whenever the party encounter monsters or a threat, they can't just go supernova and cast fireball and kill every goblin within a 30-mile radius instantly. They need to really think about the resources that they're using, because they won't get them all back instantly. You actually need to make encounters less difficult if you're going to use these rules, because you don't want to accidentally kill the party because they don't have any resources left to be able to deal with the specific threat that you've thrown at them. But it means that you're not balancing encounters in a way that makes them more difficult. It also actually is great for just capturing a general dark fantasy vibe when people can't just cast fireball at the start of every day. If you don't have access to the Grim Hollow books, you can also use a simple tweak, which I've used in the past, which is when a party member is reduced to 0 hit points and they go down in a combat, if they are revived, they take a level of exhaustion when they get back up. And this means that the party are much less cavalier about just running into combat, knowing that the cleric or the bard is just going to get them back into the fight with a healing word if they ever go down. Monsters are either intelligent or evolved. And what I mean by that is that monsters are fundamentally aware of what their own capabilities and attributes are, much like we're all aware of what we're basically capable of. Monsters, in another way of putting it, know what's written on their stat block, and they will use those abilities to the fullest effect when fighting party members. This is kind of just general encounter building advice, but it's relevant because it helps you make encounters that are more dangerous without necessarily throwing in a whole load more goblins to try to overwhelm the party. You're just making sure that the monsters use their own strategies to the fullest effect, which makes them inherently more dangerous. So for example, let's use goblins. Goblins have their nimble escape ability, which means that they can either disengage and run away, or they can hide as a bonus action on their turn in addition to attacking. This makes goblins expert ambushers because it allows them to rain arrows down from a hidden position and then go hide again before those they've attacked are able to react to them. Goblins also probably know they're not particularly tough. They can't take more than a single sword swing in many situations, or a single arrow would be enough to knock them out of their tree. Therefore, goblins know that they have to hide if they want to remain safe. So this information tells us that if you're going to use goblins in a campaign, create an ambush, because that's the tactics the goblins would use. That's what they're going to be best at. If a monster isn't intelligent, it's got an intelligence score of 3 or less. I think the difference between intelligence 3 and 4 is sort of what's considered to be, basically an animal and sentient. Then they're still evolved. That doesn't mean that they're any less intelligent about the way that they're going to encounter or engage the party. It means that they know how to use their natural environment, they know what makes them safest, and they instinctually behave in a way that makes full use of their stat block, even if they're not using sophisticated tactics like a kobold using pack tactics or a goblin running away so that they can't get reprised upon. For example, I like to use griffins as a relatively early sort of level 3, level 4 encounter for parties who are going out and exploring the wilderness. And I like the idea that griffins only really become dangerous if they're in a mating pair, because this means that they're going and they're getting extra food, they're killing livestock, they might be killing people, they might be trying to get horses. I think it mentions that in the monster manual. They go after horses on carriages, and that makes them a particular problem for trading caravans that are on the roads. Anyway, the point being that because they only really become dangerous when they're in a mating pair, this means that when the party are hired to go and slay the griffin, there's probably going to be more than one of them. And this inherently makes the encounter far more dangerous. Shadows should only appear at night, and fire elementals don't appear around large bodies of water. I mean, that's why you want to take a bucket of water with you when you go to fight a fire elemental, to throw water on the fire elemental. I'm not sure how much damage that would do per se. I'm having a weird...
Benjamin, if you hit me with that in a game, I would be so mad at you. I would be so
But
mad
if you have a bucket of water
well,
and there's a house on fire...
it is doing additional damage.
I'm melting! I'm melting!
If I'm in...
One of the most commonly misunderstood things about dark fantasy, or at least something that causes a lot of things that aren't really dark fantasy to be labeled as such, is a misunderstanding that dark fantasy is more than just gothic aesthetic or grim aesthetic or Lovecraftian horror aesthetic. It's also about theme.
It must now serve my purpose. What purpose?
Dark fantasy is a space in which to explore themes that make folks uncomfortable or make them sad or make them fearful. And so that's why a lot of this video is talking about finding ways to make your monsters unnerve your players or make them anxious, because that's what dark fantasy is designed to do. It's designed to tackle topics that aren't entirely comfortable. And your monsters are the perfect vehicle by which to deliver the themes. So when you're choosing monsters, you should choose them very carefully. Throughout human history, monsters were used to explain things that made us feel scared or anxious or uncertain. Disease was a witch's curse. An erupting volcano was caused by a dragon or a chimera. Mania or hysteria was caused by fairies. And these were ways for us to explain things that we didn't understand at the time. Part of the fun of exploring a dark fantasy setting is presenting a problem like this. There's a family of missing children. Well, it turns out that Fae took them. Or there's folks drowning off the shore of a particular village, and it's not a tidal rip or just bad luck or they're getting trapped under rocks. There's a monster that lurks there that is dragging them under and drowning them. And this is a way for us to engage our fears and dialogue with our fears and feel like we can conquer them because we're playing heroes that can overcome them rather than being powerless as we often are in the real world. This is what attracts me to dark fantasy, if I'm honest. When a lot of people shy away from it because they feel that they want the escapism or the power fantasy, that's perfectly valid. But I love the monsters of dark fantasy because they allow me to feel like I can overcome existential threats, even if it's not going to be easy to do so. To keep the atmosphere of a dark fantasy campaign consistent, you should be thinking about the story that envelops the monsters that you've chosen to feature. And this story could tie back into the themes or the fears that you want to explore with your players. But if the monster choice isn't thought through properly, it can kind of break the atmosphere if suddenly, while the party are exploring the bottom of a dingy crypt fighting undead, for some reason a pixie springs up out of nowhere to give them a riddle. That might just feel not quite right with the atmosphere of what's actually happening within the game.
Sentries, what do you see?
So when you're choosing your monsters, think of a couple of things, and this is true for the big, bad, evil final boss monster at the end of your campaign or story arc, or just the random encounter monsters that they're going to find while exploring the dungeon. The first thing to think about is how the monster got to be in the physical place where it is and why it's there. Is this the natural environment of this monster? Is it most comfortable here? Has it been sent here from somewhere else, or has it been summoned? Perhaps it's a construct that has been sent by an evil wizard, or maybe it's a demon that has forced its way into the mortal realm because the place the party are exploring is one of great evil. Secondly, think about what the monster wants and how the monster gets it. This could be as simple as your monster is a predator, it's a griffin, it's a direwolf. What it wants is to eat, and it gets it by hunting, possibly livestock or possibly live people and killing them and dragging them off into the woods. Or perhaps your predator gets what it wants because it's fed by a tribe of goblins that keep it and use it as a war animal. Or maybe your monster is more intelligent, more esoteric. It's a dragon that lives atop a mountain where it can lair safely, and it demands gold from the local lord because it wants to build its hoard as big as it possibly can. That brings us to the next thing you should think about when building the narrative of your monster, which is, what does the monster do that brings it into conflict with either the party or its surrounding area, the society that is going to hire the party to go and kill it? This could be that the dragon is draining the local county of all of its monetary resources. The lord can't pay the taxes to the king. They can't buy grain to plant on their farms, and things are starting to get a bit desperate. So they send the party up the top of the mountain to fight the dragon. Or it could be something as simple as, there are zombies in this dusty crypt. They're here because the necromancer was doing experiments in raising the dead and has actually just left them there to wander around. He doesn't care about them once they've been raised. The conflict is that they find the party and they are kind of programmed by the nature of being undead to want to kill living things, and that brings them into conflict with the party. When you're constructing narratives around your monsters, do feel free to use a mix of both unintelligent monsters that just want to fight and also intelligent monsters that the party can talk to, negotiate with, deceive, or impress, barter. All of these things can happen with a monster encounter. It doesn't all just have to be about fighting. And that's what you need to know about featuring monsters in your dark fantasy campaign. That's the end of the video. If I missed anything, if you have any comments or questions, please leave them down below. I do try to get around to a couple of them. And Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you want more tips about running a Dark Fantasy 5th edition campaign, because it can definitely be tricky, and I still have plenty of more to share.